They painted over my wall photos. Every single one of them, without asking, without even the courtesy of a warning, as if those faces and moments, those decades of birthdays and graduations and Sunday mornings in the garden, were nothing more than clutter that could be rolled into oblivion with 2 coats of sage mist paint. I came back from the pharmacy one afternoon, still fumbling with the zipper of my coat and the paper bag of my prescriptions, and the smell of fresh paint hit me before I even set foot in the hallway. I remember standing there for a moment, frozen, my ears full of the humming of a portable fan somewhere down the corridor, my eyes stinging, not from the fumes, though they were strong enough, but from the sudden sight of my wall stripped bare, all the black frames gone, the nail holes patched, the old color buried under a smooth, glossy green that someone had the audacity to call neutral. It was as if the years I had lived, the people I had loved, and the faces I still talked to when no one was listening, had been declared irrelevant, surplus to the requirements of my daughter's version of a home. I am 81 years old now, and I live alone in a small, rented cottage with floors that tilt slightly toward the back door and a roof that leaks a little in heavy rain. But it is mine, or at least mine to inhabit without someone deciding what should or should not be seen. The walls here are bare too, but bare by choice, and that makes all the difference in the world. It wasn't supposed to be like this. After my fall last winter, the one where I slipped on the ice behind the old post office and lay there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, my daughter insisted I come and live with her for a while. She said it the way people do when they are trying to sound casual, almost lighthearted, but their eyes are measuring you, calculating. Just until you're steady again, Mom. You need a bit of looking after. It sounded kind at the time, maybe even generous, and I let myself believe it because I wanted to. I wanted to think there was still a place for me in her world beyond the occasional Sunday lunch and perfunctory phone call on my birthday. I arrived with 2 suitcases, a sewing basket, and 3 cardboard boxes of framed photographs, which she helped me carry up to the room she said would be mine. "We'll make it feel like home," she promised, though I noticed the way she hesitated before the word home, as if it were a costume I would wear for the benefit of her conscience, rather than a truth we would share. In those first weeks, I told myself the changes were small and harmless. The rearrangement of my things, for better flow. The relocation of my favorite chair to the garage because it didn't fit the pallet. The slow disappearance of my books from the living room shelves. But then came the day of the wall. That hallway had been mine in a way no other part of her house was. She had let me hang my photos there, perhaps because it was a narrow space few guests lingered in, a kind of compromise between inclusion and invisibility. I had arranged them carefully. My parents on their wedding day in 1939, my late husband in his uniform before shipping out, my daughter as a gap-toothed 6-year-old holding a kite twice her size, my own hands dusted with flour as I rolled out pastry. Beside my first grandchild, they were not just decorations. They were my proof, my testimony, the chapters of a story I still believed was worth telling. And then, in the span of an afternoon, they were gone. Replaced by a flat expanse of paint that smelled faintly of something chemical and final. My daughter's explanation came later, in the kitchen, as she poured herself a glass of mineral water and barely glanced at me. "We're updating the look, Mom. The place needs to feel lighter. Buyers like clean lines." Buyers. As if the house were already halfway out of our hands, as if my presence in it was just a temporary inconvenience in a real estate transaction. I wish I could tell you I said something sharp or defiant in that moment. But the truth is, I didn't. I stood there with my hands resting on the edge of the counter, feeling the cool stone under my palms, and I let her words wash over me like the paint over my memories. I told myself it was only walls, only frames, only things. But in the quiet part of my mind, the part that still keeps score even when I pretend not to, I understood that this was not about decor. It was about erasure. It was about the silent rewriting of a history she no longer wanted to display. Perhaps because it did not fit the image she had built for herself, an image of a woman entirely self-made, untethered from the awkward weight of an aging mother, with old-fashioned tastes and stubborn attachments. In that moment, I felt smaller than I had in years. Smaller than when I stood in front of doctors explaining my fall. Smaller than when I first moved into the house of a man who loved me but could never quite make space for my ambitions. I was a guest in my own daughter's home, and the rent I paid was my silence. Now, here in this crooked little cottage with its second-hand curtains and mismatched plates, I sometimes walk my fingers along the bare plaster and think about that hallway. I think about the way the light used to catch on the glass of the frames in the late afternoon, when the sun came in at just the right angle, and how it made each face glow for a few minutes before the shadows returned. I think about how, even on days when my legs hurt too much to go outside, I could walk that narrow stretch and feel accompanied by the people I had loved, by the moments that had shaped me. And I think about how quickly it can all be made to vanish when someone decides that your history is an eyesore. But here's the thing they never seem to understand. You can paint over the walls, but you can't paint over the person who remembers what was there. It was the afternoon when I truly understood that the life I had known, or at least the one I thought I had, was slipping through my fingers in a way no hand could grasp. That morning had started like many others since I had moved in with my daughter. A ritual of quiet coffees and the hum of the television in the background. The soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen, where she busied herself with preparations I no longer had a role in. I sat in the faded armchair that had replaced my own at the edge of the living room, a chair chosen not for comfort, but for style, with sharp edges and too little cushioning. I watched the way the sunlight moved through the window panes, casting long shadows across the floorboards that no longer creaked with the familiar rhythm I had come to associate with home. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen that I did not yet understand. I went to the hallway to hang my coat, as I always did. But the wall that greeted me was unrecognizable. The smooth, painted surface was cold and alien, unblemished by the fingerprints and scuffs that had marked it for decades. I reached out to touch it, my fingers pressing lightly against the flat expanse, searching for a trace of the past. Maybe a tiny ridge where the old frames had hung, or a faint outline where the sun had bleached the wallpaper. But there was nothing. Not a single mark remained to tell the story of the life that had once thrived here. My heart tightened in my chest, a slow, aching squeeze that I could not shake. I turned back toward the kitchen, where my daughter was moving among the cupboards with the efficiency of a woman who had everything planned and nothing to lose. "They're gone," I said quietly, the words barely more than a whisper. She paused, her hands stilling on a glass jar, and without looking at me, she replied, "We needed a fresh start, Mom. You understand, don't you? It's just paint. Walls can be painted over." Her voice was steady, calm, but there was an undercurrent of finality beneath it, a note I could not ignore. I nodded, though inside I was shaking, unsure if I was agreeing or surrendering. The day wore on like that, small moments of distance growing into a chasm that I was powerless to cross. I tried to bring up the photos again, the ones I had collected with care and nostalgia, each one a fragment of a life I had lived fully and fiercely. But my words were met with polite dismissal. "Those things belong to the past," she said once, "and the past doesn't sell houses." I watched her move through the house, orchestrating the placement of furniture, the selection of cushions and throws, each choice a statement that spoke louder than words. This was her domain now, and I was merely an accessory, a relic to be displayed or discarded at her discretion. The more I tried to find my place, the more I felt myself slipping into a role I had never auditioned for, that of the invisible woman, the faded presence in a picture that had been repainted without her consent. That evening, when the house was quiet and the world outside had softened into shadows, I sat alone in the dim light of my room and pulled out one of my old photo albums. I turned the pages slowly, tracing the images with a trembling finger. The wedding day of my parents, the first smile of my daughter, the baby steps of my grandchildren, all the faces that had been erased from the walls, now held between the fragile sheets of paper. I pressed my forehead against the album, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me, a sorrow so profound it was almost physical. How had I become a stranger in my own family? How had the people I loved most become the ones who painted over my memories, who brushed me aside like dust on a forgotten shelf? The answer came, unbidden and cold. They no longer needed me. Not really. They had created a new narrative, one that did not include the messy, inconvenient woman I had become. I was excess, a complication in their carefully curated lives. The realization settled like a shadow across my chest, heavy and unyielding. I wanted to scream, to demand my place back, but my voice was swallowed by the walls that had swallowed my photos. Instead, I sat in silence, the quietest kind of violence pressing against my ribs. Days passed, each one a repetition of the last. The paint on the walls dried and hardened, sealing away the past, and with it, a part of my spirit. I found myself retreating further into the corners of the house, avoiding the living room where the echoes of absent pictures haunted the empty spaces. I began to sleep less, waking in the early hours with the sting of loss fresh on my skin, the cold ache of being forgotten, a constant companion. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the small utility room, my daughter entered with a folder of papers and a tone that was disturbingly light. "I've spoken to a lawyer," she said. "We're just making sure everything's in order. You understand how important it is to have these things handled properly at your age." The words cut sharper than any knife. Handled properly, as if I were a fragile object to be boxed up and stored away, not a woman still capable of choice, of thought, of resistance. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not the daughter I had raised, but a stranger wielding authority I had never granted. "I'm not ready," I said softly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. She smiled then, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You don't have to be," she said. "That's why we're doing it for you." The days that followed were a blur of visits from strangers in suits and polite questions, forms to sign, and medical appointments scheduled without my input. The house became a stage for a drama in which I was cast as a supporting role, a character whose lines were pre-written and whose fate was sealed before the curtain even rose. I fought in small ways, refusing to surrender my keys, hiding important papers in a drawer, writing letters I never sent. But the tide was relentless. It was during one of those long nights when sleep eluded me, and the shadows seemed to whisper truths I was not ready to hear. That I made a decision. If they wanted to erase me, to repaint my life in colors not my own, then I would find a way to write my story anew on my own terms, beyond the reach of walls and paint and carefully curated homes. I would leave not in anger or despair, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows that the most important home is the one you carry inside yourself. That night, I packed a small bag, took the emergency envelope I had hidden for years, and slipped out into the dark with nothing but the clothes on my back and the name I refused to lose. The street was empty and the air crisp with the promise of rain, but I walked steadily, each step a reclaiming of the ground beneath me, a defiance against the erasure that had nearly swallowed me whole. They had painted over my wall photos, but I had not forgotten who I was. And that, I knew, was something they could never take away. After that night, after the quiet flight from a house that had become a gallery of erasure and silence, I found myself caught in a strange liminal space where the familiar and the unknown blurred at the edges, a threshold between the life I had lost and the one I was only beginning to imagine. I did not rush into anything, because rushing would have meant desperation, and I was determined to walk slowly, deliberately, as if each step could stitch together the fragments of a story interrupted too soon. The rented cottage where I now stayed was modest, its floors uneven and its paint chipped in places. But it was mine in a way the house I had left never was anymore. Here, the walls were blank canvases, empty, not because they had been scrubbed clean by others, but because I had not yet chosen what to place upon them. There was a quiet dignity in that emptiness, a promise that the past, though it could not be erased, did not have to define the future. In the days that followed, I settled into a rhythm that was at once unfamiliar and deeply needed. Mornings began with the soft light filtering through threadbare curtains as I brewed a cup of instant coffee, the bitter taste a small comfort against the silence. I walked slowly through the nearby streets, the sidewalks cracked and worn like the lines on my own hands, and the scent of rain and earth mingled in the air, grounding me in the present. Sometimes I paused by a faded brick wall covered in peeling posters, fragments of other people's stories layered over each other, and I thought about how lives, like walls, were patched and repainted, sometimes leaving traces beneath the surface that only the patient eye could see, but the quiet was deceptive. Beneath it, currents of change stirred, and with each passing day, the loss I had felt so sharply began to morph into something else, a fragile, tentative form of resolve. The things I had left behind, the painted walls, the erased photos, the whispered conversations about downsizing and redecorating, had attempted to erase not only my past, but the very fact of my existence as someone who mattered. Yet here I was, alive and breathing, a woman who remembered every line, every laugh, every tear that those vanished images had once held. I was no longer willing to be a ghost in my own life. I started small. I unpacked the boxes I had brought, carefully folding each item and placing it in drawers and shelves that no one else's hands had touched. I found an old photograph tucked between the pages of a novel I had carried with me, a picture of my late husband and me on our wedding day, smiling with a kind of reckless hope that seemed almost like a promise. I pinned it to the blank wall with a crooked thumbtack, a first claim on the space that was finally mine to fill. It was not much, but it was enough to remind me that I had a right to remember. From there, I began to rebuild, not just a home, but a sense of self. I looked for work, hesitant at first, uncertain if anyone would want a woman my age who had spent decades as a wife, mother, and grandmother, never needing to clock in or out, but always laboring, nonetheless. Yet, in the local cafe down the street, a modest place with chipped mugs and the smell of burnt toast, I found a manager who looked beyond my age and offered me a morning shift. The work was steady and honest, pouring coffee, wiping tables, exchanging pleasantries with early risers who barely noticed the slow rhythm of my steps. There was dignity in the routine, a kind of healing in the simple act of showing up and being counted. With that first paycheck, small as it was, I did something that felt radical. I bought a coat. It was a navy wool coat with a subtle herringbone pattern, not new but well-made and warm, the kind of coat that holds you close against the cold and tells the world you have not given up. When I slipped it on and buttoned it at the neck, I looked in the mirror and saw not the woman who had been painted over and left behind, but someone who was still here, still standing, still capable of choosing her own shape. The coat became a talisman, a symbol of the slow reclaiming of a life I had once taken for granted. But the past was not silent. It came in small, insistent ways that tested the fragile boundaries I was building around myself. Letters arrived, unsigned or in the familiar hand of my grandson, Kieran, who had been the only one to reach out with genuine concern. His words were a balm and a reminder. He remembered me as I was, not as I had been erased. Yet other messages were less kind. My daughter's calls were sporadic, clipped, and often tinged with impatience, as if my presence was an inconvenience she tolerated rather than a relationship she valued. Once, when I answered the phone, her voice was sharp, and she warned me about making a scene and disrupting the family peace. The phrase echoed in my mind, a cruel irony considering how much peace I had sacrificed to keep the family together all these years. One afternoon, as I was walking home from the cafe, I noticed a real estate flyer posted on a lamppost. It showed the house I had left, now freshly painted and staged to perfection, with smiling faces and empty walls. The description boasted of modern updates and a fresh, clean aesthetic, but made no mention of the woman who had once filled its rooms with laughter and life. I folded the flyer carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket, a silent testament to the fact that some stories are rewritten without consent, but not without witnesses. The tension between past and present, between erasure and remembrance, became a quiet pulse in my days. I found small acts of resistance in the routines I created, placing my keys on the same hook every evening, keeping a journal of the moments that mattered, and writing letters I sometimes sent and sometimes kept hidden. Each act was a stitch in the fabric of a new life, one I was determined to weave with intention and care. I learned to say no without guilt, to choose solitude without shame, and to find strength in the spaces where others had sought to make me invisible. And yet, even as I built this new life, I was aware of the fragile nature of what I was creating. The threat of being swallowed again by the tides of family expectation and societal disregard lingered like a shadow just beyond the edge of the day. I knew that to survive, I would need not only courage, but also patience and a steady heart. The painted-over walls of my past had been a warning and a lesson. No one gives up their power willingly, but neither do they surrender it without a fight. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the house was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, I would run my fingers over the edges of the photographs I had reclaimed and whisper my own name, a reminder, a promise. I was still here. I was still myself, and I would not be painted over again. There was a moment, sometime in the middle of that slow, tentative life I was piecing together, when I realized that I was no longer merely surviving, but beginning to breathe again in a way I had not thought possible. It was not a sudden awakening or a dramatic shift, but a quiet, almost imperceptible change that crept into the edges of my days like the first light through a cracked window. The small cottage where I had made my refuge was no longer just a shelter from the past. It was becoming a place where I could begin to reclaim my story, not as a fragment of someone else's narrative, but as the author of my own. It was during one of those long mornings when the rain tapped softly against the pane that I first dared to pick up a paintbrush and make a mark of my own on the blank walls that surrounded me. I had spent years watching my life be painted over, layer upon layer of other people's choices, decisions made in my name, but never with my consent. The walls that once held photographs of people I loved, memories I cherished, had been scrubbed clean, wiped bare as if to erase not only images, but the very essence of who I was. But here, in this small space that no one else visited or judged, I found the courage to reclaim a fragment of my identity in a way that was both simple and profound. With trembling hands, I dipped the brush into a pot of deep blue paint and drew my name across a wide wooden plank I found in the shed behind the cottage. Marinette Louise, my full name, painted in bold, uneven strokes that refused to be quiet or modest. The act was more than just putting letters on wood. It was a declaration, a boundary set against erasure and invisibility. Later that week, when the light was just right and the shadows fell gently across the front porch, I nailed that plank above the door, a guardian of sorts, a sign that this was no longer a place where I would be hidden or ignored. The neighbors, simple folk with weathered hands and kindly eyes, paused when they saw it. Some smiled and nodded in recognition. Others asked if I was expecting company, while a few looked on with confusion. It did not matter. What mattered was that I had marked my territory, not with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet pride that felt like a small revolution. My daughter's reaction was swift and sharp when she came to visit. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. "That has to come down," she said, as if the name I had painted were a trespass on her carefully curated world. "It's not appropriate. It sends the wrong message." But I did not flinch. I told her calmly that this was my home now, too, that I would decide how it was marked. The silence that followed was thick, heavier than any words we could have exchanged. It was a fracture in the fragile thread that still connected us, but one I was no longer afraid to widen. This act of reclaiming was mirrored in other small ways. I returned to the cafe where I worked and began to take pride in my presence there, no longer just a temporary fixture, but someone who had earned her place through persistence and quiet determination. The regulars began to recognize me, not as an old woman passing through, but as part of the fabric of their mornings, the one who knew just how they liked their coffee and who greeted them with a smile that was genuine and steady. I started keeping a small notebook, jotting down recipes and ideas for simple dishes, remembering how to make lemon squares the way my mother had taught me, how to fold dough so it rose just right. These were small acts of care, not just for others but for myself, a reclaiming of skills and joys that had been buried beneath years of obligation and neglect. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea and the soft hum of the radio in the background, I found myself writing a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to the woman I used to be, the one who had lost her way amid the noise and chaos, of family drama and fading memories. I wrote of forgiveness, not for those who had wronged me, but for myself, for the years I had spent shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I wrote of hope, not as a grand promise, but as a quiet companion that would walk beside me through whatever came next. And as I folded the letter and tucked it into my dresser drawer, I felt a lightness I had not known in a long time, a sense that I was finally beginning to inhabit the space between past and future, with intention and grace. Of course, the journey was not without its challenges. The past would not simply recede like a tide at my command. There were moments when the weight of loneliness pressed down, when the silence of the cottage felt too vast, and the absence of family, though chosen, was sharp and aching. There were days when I doubted my own strength, when the memories of painted-over walls haunted the edges of my mind like ghosts that refused to be exorcised. But even in those moments, I reminded myself that healing is not a straight line, that the path to reclaiming one's life is marked by detours and pauses as much as by forward steps. I found solace in new friendships, too. Simple connections forged over shared meals and conversations that did not require explanation or apology. Joyce, my landlord and sometime confidant, was a woman of few words but deep understanding, the kind of person who knew the value of silence and the strength of a well-timed cup of coffee. Together, we navigated the rhythms of our small community, finding moments of joy in the mundane and laughter in the unexpected. It was a reminder that even as the walls around me changed, the human connections that give life meaning could be rebuilt, brick by brick, heart by heart. The day I realized I was no longer just marking time, but living it, was a quiet one. I was standing in front of the window, watching the wind stir the leaves outside, the sky a soft gray that promised rain, but held back for just a little longer. I reached up and touched the wooden plank above the door, my name written there in deep blue, and I smiled to myself, a slow, steady smile that carried with it the weight of everything I had lost and the lightness of everything I had yet to find. I was no longer painted over. I was painting myself back in, stroke by deliberate stroke, a work in progress that would never be finished, but would always be true. The past, as it often does, returned not with the force of a tempest, but like a slow and steady tide, pressing against the fragile boundaries I had spent months constructing around my new life. It came in letters, in visits, in the quiet weight of memories I could no longer ignore, even if I wanted to. My grandson Kieran was the first to reach out, his handwriting familiar and hesitant, filled with concern and a yearning I hadn't realized I still craved. His letters were small islands of warmth in a sea of coldness, reminders that not all ties had been severed, that even in the distance, some bonds remained intact. Yet alongside his words came others, sharper, colder, letters from my daughter and son-in-law, veiled threats dressed as offers of reconciliation, reminders of obligations and expectations I had long since abandoned. It was during one of those early autumn afternoons, when the leaves had turned fiery reds and golds, and the air carried the crisp promise of coming winter, that my daughter appeared at the cafe where I worked. I had not seen her in months, not since the day she had demanded the removal of the painted plank above my door. That quiet declaration of my presence she had tried to erase as easily as she had erased my photographs. She stood by the entrance, the picture of control and carefully rehearsed concern, her eyes scanning the room as if seeking approval from strangers rather than family. I poured her a cup of coffee, black and strong, the way she always took it when she visited, and set it before her without a word. "You should come home, Mom," she said, voice low and urgent. the tone of someone delivering a verdict rather than an invitation. "We're worried about you. Kieran is worried. You can't keep running away like this." Her words hung between us, heavy and sharp, but I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not running," I replied. "I'm choosing." She shook her head, a faint tremor betraying the calm she tried to project. "You don't understand what's at stake. We can help you, but you have to let us. You're not well enough to live alone." It was the familiar refrain, the tired script repeated in doctors' offices and legal meetings, a narrative that painted me as fragile, incapable, in need of guardianship. But I was tired of being cast as a patient or a problem to be solved. I was a woman who had built a new life on the ashes of the old, who had reclaimed her name and her space. "I'm stronger than you think," I said quietly, "and I'm not the person you think I am." Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't name, a mixture of frustration, fear, and perhaps a glimmer of understanding. She pressed an envelope into my hands. "This is for Kieran. It's all he's asked for. You don't have to respond, but at least take it." I unfolded the letter inside, the neat handwriting unmistakably his, filled with words of longing and cautious hope. He remembered me as I was, not as they had tried to rewrite me. That evening, I read his words by the light of a single lamp, the silence around me punctuated only by the soft rustling of the paper. It was a fragile thread stretched across a gulf of years and misunderstandings, but it was a thread nonetheless. Yet the calm was shattered shortly after, when a man in a dark suit and polished shoes appeared at the cafe one morning, introducing himself as a representative for my daughter and son-in-law. His manner was polite but firm, a legal instrument wielded with the precision of a scalpel. He spoke of concerns for my safety, of the necessity of arranging care and protecting assets. The words were familiar, rehearsed, the language of power cloaked in kindness. I listened without interruption, then folded my apron and set it on the counter. "Tell them," I said, voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, "that I am not their project or their possession. There are no decisions to be made without me." The lawyer's eyes flickered with surprise, perhaps annoyance, but he nodded and left, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any confrontation. The threat was clear, though unspoken. The fight was not over, and the battle lines were drawn not only over property or possessions, but over my very autonomy. I was reminded, painfully, that reclaiming one's life after decades of invisibility is a journey marked by constant vigilance, by the need to defend not just space, but the right to exist on one's own terms. In the weeks that followed, I received more letters, formal notices, legal documents, and occasional notes from family members trying to bridge the growing divide. The local newspaper ran a story on my disappearance, painted in tones of concern and mystery, quoting my daughter's pleas for my return and her fears for my well-being. The article was accompanied by an old photograph of me, smiling in a garden at a family gathering years before, a frozen image that seemed to mock the reality of my current struggle. I read it with a mix of bitterness and resolve, knowing that the public performance of worry was often a mask for control, that concern can be weaponized in the hands of those who seek to confine rather than comfort. Amidst this pressure, I found unexpected allies in the small community I had begun to call home. Joyce, my landlord, offered quiet support, a steady presence in the swirling storm. Heather, the cafe manager, gave me extra shifts without question, her simple acts of kindness a balm to the bruised spirit. And then there was Arthur, A widower who came in each morning with his newspaper and a gentle smile, the kind of man who listened without judgment and spoke with the wisdom of someone who had seen life's relentless tides. Our conversations, often about birds or the weather, became a refuge, a reminder that connection can be found even in the unlikeliest of places. One afternoon, as Arthur handed me a small, hand-painted magnet shaped like a birdhouse, he said quietly, "Sometimes the smallest things remind us who we are." I tucked it into my coat pocket, a talisman against the encroaching shadows. It was in these moments, surrounded by the ordinary kindness of strangers and the simple rituals of daily life, that I found the strength to hold my ground, to refuse to be swept away by the currents of family expectations and societal pressures. But the past was relentless. One evening, my daughter appeared unannounced at the cottage, her expression guarded, her words measured. She did not ask to come in, but stood on the porch, the wind tugging at her scarf. "We want to help," she said. "We want to find a way back." I looked at her, at the woman who had once been my child and now seemed a stranger shaped by fear and frustration. "Help is only welcome when it respects the one it is meant for," I said. "I am here. Not lost, not broken, but living. If you want me in your life, meet me where I am." The days stretched on, a delicate dance of distance and tentative outreach. I wrote letters, not always sent, expressing truths that had long been buried beneath layers of silence and pain. I met with lawyers to assert my rights, to ensure that my choices would be respected, to carve out a space where my voice could be heard. The fight was exhausting, often lonely, but it was mine, and in owning it, I reclaimed a power I had forgotten I possessed. One night, as the rain fell softly against the window panes and the cottage was filled with the warm glow of a single lamp, I sat with a pen in my hand and wrote a letter, not to my daughter, not to the lawyer, but to the woman I was becoming. I wrote of resilience, of the courage to say no, of the freedom found in claiming one's own life. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, a promise to myself that whatever came next, I would stand firm. Painted not over, but painted back in, stroke by determined stroke. The moment I decided to write that final letter, it was not born from anger or bitterness, but from a place of quiet, resolute clarity that had taken months to arrive at. A stillness amid the storm that no longer begged for attention, but demanded respect. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rented cottage, the same one that had become my sanctuary and my battleground. The soft light from the single lamp casting long shadows across the scattered papers and the half-empty cup of tea that had gone. Cold beside me, the pen moved slowly in my hand as I composed words I had rehearsed countless times in my mind, but had never dared to speak aloud. To my daughter, Lisa, I wrote only a few lines. 3 sentences that cut through years of silence and displacement. A clear boundary drawn in ink that said everything and nothing all at once. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. The letter was not a plea nor a demand, but a quiet declaration of independence that echoed louder than any shouted argument could have. Sending that letter felt like sealing a door behind me, a door I would not open again for them, not on their terms, nor on mine until I was ready, if ever. It was an act of finality that released me from the tangled web of expectation and obligation that had ensnared me for decades. I mailed it with a stamp adorned by a simple bird in flight, a finch, the kind I had come to love for its unyielding song even in the coldest seasons. I walked to the post office that morning with a calm I had not known in years, the crisp air filling my lungs as if with new life. There was no turning back, and for the first time, I welcomed that. In the days that followed, the silence from their side was deafening, yet I did not miss the calls or the messages that came before, with their subtle accusations and veiled apologies. I was free from the performance of concern, the manipulation wrapped in smiles, and "we just want what's best for you." My new life had become a tapestry, woven from small victories and quiet moments of grace, each thread a testament to the woman who refused to be erased. I continued to work at the cafe, the rhythm of the morning steady and grounding. Heather, the manager, surprised me one day with a new apron she had found in a clearance bin, deep green with the words stitched in gentle script, "Not your grandma's kitchen." I laughed aloud, the sound ringing clear and true, a bell tolling the end of an era and the beginning of another. Then there was the day Lisa showed up unexpectedly at the cafe, her expression unreadable beneath the soft drizzle that had begun to fall outside. Heather spotted her first, a woman in a tailored coat standing stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu but waiting for something I could not name. I did not approach her. Instead, I finished my shift, counting tips with steady hands before walking home in the fading afternoon light. The sidewalk shimmered with leftover rain, and the coat I wore held the warmth of movement and choice. Lisa did not enter, only lingered for a moment before turning away, her retreat a silent acknowledgement of the boundary I had drawn so firmly. That evening, sitting on the porch with Joyce wrapped in an old quilt, watching the moon rise over the quiet street, I felt the weight of everything I had endured and the strength I had reclaimed. Joyce, with her blunt wisdom and steady presence, simply said, "You know they're going to show up, right?" I nodded, knowing she was right, that the past has a way of sniffing you out just when you think you've left it behind. But I was no longer afraid. This time, I would meet them on my own terms, or not at all. The final cut came when the lawyer representing Adam and Lisa stepped through the cafe door, his presence a reminder that the fight was not yet over. He spoke with practiced civility, outlining their concerns and intentions, suggesting next steps they thought prudent for my well-being and financial security. But I was no longer the quiet woman who nodded politely and swallowed her protests. I folded my apron neatly, placed it on the counter, and looked him in the eye. "Tell Adam and Lisa I am not a pet to be managed or a problem to be solved. There are no next steps unless I take them. I am of sound mind, living in a safe environment, and I will not be moved without my consent." His polite smile faltered, and for a moment I saw a flicker of respect behind the professional mask. In the days that followed, the edges of that confrontation softened into the steady glow of a life finally settled. I wrote one last letter to that lawyer, brief and firm. "To whom it may concern, there is no cause for further legal contact. I have retained local counsel. Any further attempts under the guise of concern will be considered harassment." Signed and mailed, it was the final stroke on a canvas long painted with struggle and resilience. At the cafe, the rhythm of my days settled into a gentle certainty. Arthur came by each morning, his cane tapping softly on the floor, and we shared quiet moments over tea instead of coffee, the change a small concession to age and comfort. "You look lighter," he said one day, and I smiled, thinking of the letters, the boundaries, the new life I had built piece by piece. "I wrote a letter," I told him. "The last one." He nodded, as if understanding that sometimes the most powerful words are those spoken in silence or sent without expectation of reply. That night, standing in the doorway of my little cottage, the house filled with the warm aroma of garlic and simmering sauce, I felt a peace that had been elusive for so long. Franklin, the cat who had claimed me as much as I had claimed this space, rubbed against my legs, and Joyce, ever the steady companion, smiled from the kitchen. We ate in quiet contentment, the kind that comes not from grand gestures, but from the simple fact of presence. I was no longer painted over. I was fully here, fully seen, and fully myself. They say that time softens everything, but the truth I have learned is more complicated. Time does not erase pain or betrayal. It only teaches you how to live with them differently. In the quiet aftermath of what felt like a storm that might never end, I found a stillness that was not resignation, but a steadying of the spirit. The little cottage, with its uneven floors and peeling paint, became a refuge not just for my body, but for the parts of me that had been forgotten or dismissed for so long. I began to plant herbs in chipped pots along the windowsill: basil, rosemary, thyme, simple things that grew slowly but surely, stubborn in their persistence, much like myself. Each sprout was a reminder that life, even after loss, could renew itself in small, beautiful ways. I wrote letters, though not all were sent. Some were to my daughter, though they went unanswered. Others were to the woman I once was, a kind of dialogue across time and pain. The act of writing became a ritual, a way to hold on to my voice when it felt like the world was trying to steal it away. In those letters, I told myself that I was enough, that my memories were valid, that my presence mattered, that the name I had painted above my door was not just letters on wood, but a proclamation of existence. I imagined another woman, someone who might be walking a similar path of invisibility and erasure, and I wrote to her across the distance, hoping my words would be a beacon in her darkness. The friendships I had begun to forge in this small town deepened into lifelines. Joyce, who had become more than a landlord, was often the first to hear my stories, the ones I told in fragments and hesitations, but also the ones I told in fierce declarations of self-worth and hope. She listened without judgment, her steady presence a reminder that kindness is often the quietest revolution. Arthur continued to visit, his gentle humor and shared silences a balm for the loneliness that sometimes crept in. Together, in those simple connections, I found a community that did not ask me to shrink or disappear, but welcomed me in all my flawed and fierce humanity. There were moments when the old wounds ached sharply, like the sudden sting of a cold wind or the unexpected scent of a perfume that once belonged to someone now distant. I would find myself staring at the blank walls in the kitchen, or touching the chipped edge of the wooden plank with my name, feeling the weight of all that had been lost, but also the strength of all that had been reclaimed. I learned that healing is not about forgetting or erasing, but about making peace with the fractured pieces of a life lived fully, with all its imperfections and scars. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the sunlight dance through the leaves, I thought about the women I had known in my lifetime. The mothers, the daughters, the grandmothers, who had been silenced or sidelined, whose stories had been painted over like the walls of my former home. I thought about the power in speaking truth, in reclaiming space, in insisting on being seen. My letter to that unknown woman was a promise and a challenge, that even when the world tries to erase you, you can paint yourself back in, one deliberate stroke at a time. As the seasons changed, bringing new colors and new rhythms, I felt the quiet blossoming of something I had feared lost forever. Hope. Not the flashy, blinding kind, but a gentle, persistent light that warmed from within and guided me forward. I knew the past would always be part of me, but it no longer controlled me. I was free to write the next chapters of my life with a steady hand and an open heart. And so I live now in this small cottage, surrounded by growing herbs, the faint scent of old wood and fresh paint mingling in the air, the soft presence of friends, and a cat who keeps me company. I am no longer a shadow on someone else's walls, but a woman who has reclaimed her name, her story, and her dignity. To any woman who feels erased or unseen, I say this: you are here. You are enough. Paint your name boldly. Make your mark. The world may try to cover it up, but your story will always find a way to shine through.